This will be our last lesson on fruit, and will cover tree fruit other than apples, which was covered in our last lesson. Pears are a crop that we can grow well in Kansas. Often, if there is one tree still alive in an abandoned orchard, it's the pear. Pears are self-unfruitful and therefore need cross-pollination. In other words, we need two different cultivars of pears to get fruit. There are exceptions, of course, such as Kiefer pear, which does not need a second cultivar to produce fruit. Pears take more years to bear fruit than most other fruit. Dwarf trees take 3 to 4 years and standard trees 5 to 7. Pear trees need less pruning than other tree fruits. This is one of the reasons that pears survive so well under neglect. Apples produce so much growth that windstorms or ice storms can tear them apart. The growth of pears is much more controlled. The major disease for pears is Fireblight. Apples are also susceptible, but pears are more so. Fireblight is a disease caused by a bacteria, not by a fungus. Therefore, fungicides do not work. Many people control this disease by pruning. Do not prune while the disease is active, but wait until a dry period during the summer. Cut back all affected tips by cutting at least 10 inches behind the affected area. Always cut back to an existing branch or side shoot. Do not leave stubs. Dip your pruners into a 10% bleach solution or a solution of rubbing alcohol between cuts to prevent spreading the disease with your pruners. I prefer rubbing alcohol as it is less corrosive to the pruners. Fireblight can also be controlled by bactericide, specifically Agri-mycin. In order to work, Agri-mycin must be used according to certain rules in order to be effective. The tree must be sprayed within 24 hours of an infection event. So what is an infection event? In order to have an infection event, open flowers are necessary as well as temperatures greater than 60 degrees and either rain or heavy dew. A spray usually lasts 3 to 4 days and must be reapplied if conditions persist. If Agri-mycin is not available locally, it can be purchased over the internet. Most fruit are at their peak quality when allowed to ripen on the tree. Pears are the exception to the rule, and often become gritty and or start rotting from the core if not harvested early. There are a number of clues as to when pears should be picked. We will list those characteristics and then provide a photo to illustrate what those characteristics are. The background color of the pear fruit should go from a dark green to light green or yellowish green. Pears should part easily from the branch when it is lifted up and twisted. The fruit will develop the characteristic aroma and taste. They will not taste ripe, but will not have a starchy flavor either. If they taste starchy, they are not ready for harvest. The last characteristic is the corking over the lenticels. Lenticels are the breathing pores of the fruit. This photo illustrates two of the characteristics we mentioned previously. The tan spots are the lenticels. If this fruit was immature, the spots would be white rather than the corky color. The color between the spots is the background or ground color. It should be lighter color than an immature fruit. Peaches can be grown in Kansas, but late spring frosts often eliminate crops. Apricots are even more sensitive to late frosts as they bloom earlier than peaches. However, in years we do have fruit, we can have an abundance. Peaches are self-fruitful, so only one cultivar is needed for fruit. Production begins the 3rd year and peaks between the 5th and 10th years, with peak production being 3 to 4 bushels per tree. In order to produce the best quality fruit, peaches should be thinned to a peach every 6 to 8 inches. Peaches will often bear in clusters, but that is not a problem as long as there are about 40 leaves per fruit. Measure the length of the limb in inches and divide by 7. This will calculate how many fruit should be on that limb, regardless of whether they are in a cluster or not. Apricots are also self-fruitful, though there are certain varieties that require a pollinator. Read the description before ordering. Production begins the 3rd to 4th year and continues over a number of years as apricots are long-lived trees. As with peaches, peak production would be about 3 to 4 bushels per tree. Apricots are smaller than peaches and therefore fruit does not need to be thinned as hard. Try to space fruit every 2 to 4 inches on average. As with peaches, it is okay if they are in clusters. Peaches require more pruning than any other fruit tree because peaches only develop on wood grown the previous year. If left unpruned, peaches are produced further and further away from the center of the tree. The weight of these fruit can break a tree apart as they have more leverage the further they are from the trunk. Apricots are totally different in regard to pruning. They produce fruit on spurs up to 5 years old. Therefore, little pruning is needed. Remove dead, diseased, or weakly attached branches, but little thinning is needed. So what do you do if you have a fruit load that is too heavy for the tree? These branches are propped up with 1x6 boards. There is a V cut in the top of the board so the branch doesn't slip. Also, each prop is actually 2 boards that can be adjusted for height by how much they overlap. The 2 boards are attached together by 3 screws with a cordless drill. This photo was taken while the fruit was still small and therefore did not weigh a great deal. This is the same tree with a full fruit load. Look how far the limbs have now drooped. Significant pruning will be needed the next spring to bring the tree back into shape. Frost protection is frequently needed for both apricots and peaches, but often is not practical. This is a photo of a young apricot tree covered with sheets. It would have been more effective if the sheets formed a tent over the tree so heat from the ground was trapped. In many cases, a heat source is required to protect the fruit. If a source of electricity is near, try using a string of old-fashioned Christmas lights. These must be the ones with 7-watt incandescent bulbs, as LED types do not put out enough heat. The most common disease for peaches is peach leaf curl. By the time you see symptoms, it is much too late to treat. For good control, a fungicide must be applied before buds swell in the spring. In some years, this can be as early as late February, but a March application is much more common. The best product to use is chlorothalonil. This is sold under the trade name of Daconil and various other trade names. Apricots are susceptible to a number of diseases, but none are common or severe enough to warrant discussion here. It is possible for us to grow both sweet and tart cherries, but sweet are much more difficult for us as we have summers that are too warm for sweet cherries. This saps energy reserves and weakens plants. Some people are successful with sweet cherries, but this is often due to a microclimate that is better adapted to their needs. Tart cherries are self-fruitful, but sweet cherries are not. Therefore, you need 2 different varieties of sweet cherry to get fruit. The sweet cherry Stella is an exception to the rule and does not need a pollinator. Tart cherries start bearing the 3rd to 4th year, but sweet cherries usually don't bear until the 5th to 7th year. Often by the time a sweet cherry is old enough to bear, it is dead. We have a couple of tart cherries that are genetic dwarves. These are trees that are naturally small rather than being kept small due to a dwarfing rootstock. The first cherry listed, the Montmorency, is not a dwarf but a full-size tree that will reach 15 feet tall. We list it because it is the most common tart cherry grown and can be dwarfed through the use of a dwarfing rootstock. For example, Montmorency can be kept to 8 to 10 feet tall if grafted to a Gisela III rootstock. However, the other 2 cherries mentioned are genetic dwarfs. North Star is 8 to 10 feet tall and has good leaf spot resistance, but is prone to bacterial canker and brown rot. Meteor is a bit larger than North Star. It is somewhat susceptible to leaf spot, but moderately resistant to bacterial canker and brown rot. The major disease on cherries is cherry leaf spot. It is rarely a severe problem in Kansas as it requires mild, wet weather. However, if trees do become infected, leaves may drop and trees may be weakened. 2 treatments are usually all that is needed for good control. The first application should be applied at bud break, and the second 10 days later. Use a product with Captan, chlorothalonil, or myclobutanil. Japanese and European plums can be grown in Kansas. European plums are the ones that are so dark purple they are almost black. Commercial, they are primarily used to make prunes, but can also be used to make preserves or jellies. Japanese plums are most often red and are eaten fresh. Japanese plum fruit are larger and juicier than European types. Japanese plums have about the same cold and heat tolerance as peaches and also bloom early like peaches. Though less hardy than European types, you usually do not have problems with cold hardiness for Japanese plums in Kansas. Unlike peaches, Japanese plums need a second tree as a pollinator. European plums are more cold hardy but less heat tolerant and bloom later, usually about the same as apples. European plums are usually self-fruitful. Plums bear on wood that is 2 to 4 years old. Therefore, little pruning is needed other than removing diseased, broken, or dead branches. Usually plums do not overbear and little thinning is needed. However, if the tree bears heavily, thin fruit to 1 every 4 to 5 inches. Well, that finishes our module on growing fruit in Kansas. There's a lot to learn as a significant amount of care is needed to produce good fruit. I hope you enjoyed the presentation.